And now we will have a panel session on the future of lifelong guidance, accepting social challenges and technological shifts.
Okay. So to start off with, I will introduce shortly the panel members who we haven't introduced here yet, but to my right-hand side first, Mr. Mart Laidmets from the Ministry of Education, who you've already heard speaking. Then we have Miss Jennifer McKenzie from the National Centre for Guidance in Education, Euroguidance Ireland, the director, and the National Centre for Guidance in Education in Ireland. Miss McKenzie was appointed to the role of director of the National Centre, an agency of the Irish Department of Education and Skills in 2010 and reappointed in 2016. And as director, she liaises with the European Commission and collaborates with national stakeholders from all sectors in guidance, providers of LLG programs, government and non-governmental organizations. Then I have next is Mr. Fonseca, who you've all already met and already heard many times. And I would probably ask him to say something new about himself.
I'm an apprentice sailor.
Yes. Then we have Miss Jenny Bimrose from Warwick University, who's a researcher based at the Institute for Employment Research. And she has over 30 years of experience teaching, researching and managing in higher education. Ongoing research interests include developing labour market information for use in careers and the integration of ICT into practice. And last but not least, Miss Martina Nichol, Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion in the European Commission. Ms. Nichol has been working in education and training area for more than 30 years, started her career at the European level at Cedefop, where she worked as policy officer responsible for lifelong learning, and this latter post led to her to Brussels following the adoption of the resolution of lifelong learning. Ms. Nichol worked on the Copenhagen process, European cooperation in the field of vocational education and training, and one of the priorities of which is promoting lifelong guidance. So very distinguished guests, all of them. And we will try to look in this panel on, of course, with a focus on social challenges and technological shifts. But mainly, of course, we will look at the future, what will be the future paths to take. And to start off with, I would like to start with Ms. Nichol about, or actually for all of you to answer, which would you suggest are the main fields onto which lifelong guidance services should progress, and bearing in mind then the social challenges and the ICT?
Thank you. Well, of course, coming from where I work in the unit that deals with vocational training and adult learning, you can imagine that I have a specific interest in lifelong learning and lifelong guidance, and particularly in the lifelong aspect, which I think is actually a bit missing. We've heard a lot of nice developments in the school sector for young people, but I think that the guidance services need to progress a lot more in the area of both initial vocational training, but also continuing vocational training of workers and continuing professional development. And all the changes that we've heard about, we're getting a lot of nice tools in place. We know more about the changes, even though we can't anticipate how quickly or not they're going to happen. But I think what we're not doing is passing this information to the workers who are going to have to deal with it. So I think a really growing area is going to be preparing workers to adapt to new tasks, to adapt, to take on new jobs in the future. And that is really an area that I didn't hear very much about over the 2 days. And then on the social side, of course, there are many of these, well, young people also needs, but also adults who are in a similar situation to NEETs. They have very low levels of formal qualifications, but they have years of experience in jobs that are also disappearing and changing. And the work that they're going to move into is different to the work that they took up maybe 20 years ago. So we really have to think about their skills, and this is why the Commission proposed a skills guarantee for them as well, and the member states, although it didn't accept a guarantee, adopted the upskilling pathways, new opportunities for adults, to offer a structured learning pathway to these adults who have to upskill in order to keep pace with the labour market. So countries have until June 2018 to sort of decide what groups are they going to focus on, because in many countries this is a huge population. I mean, there are over 63 million adults in Europe who have at best finished lower secondary education. So the plan would be to assess their skills needs and to give them an offer of learning based on that, towards a qualification or towards a job. And of course, in all of that, guidance is key in order to identify them and to assess them, to give them a tailored offer of learning. So I think this is an opportunity for guidance practitioners and guidance services to get in touch with their ministries and to make sure that whatever opportunities are put in place, that the guidance services are key here. So I think this is one way that guidance services could become more visible in the systems in the next while.
Thank you. Ms. Bimrose, if you would care to continue from there.
Okay, thank you. Well, we heard this morning from Remo and Jana about the need for reprofessionalisation of lifelong guidance. And certainly that is something that I would really identify as a major obstacle for any progression in lifelong guidance across Europe. I think England is a striking example of what's happened when the profession is deprofessionalised. And I think what we need to do is focus on the professional identity of the practitioners who are delivering our services to the clients and customers who need this help. And certainly the Employee ID project, on which I've been working with colleagues, is focusing exactly on that, how to use ICT in helping professionals with support their professional kind of identity transformation. I think one of the other things that strikes me from this conference is that we have had a rich menu of examples of tools and innovations and initiatives that have in fact focused on the headline for the conference, which is the integration of labour market information with technology. And as a researcher, I keep reminding myself that those two things are very different, in the sense that labour market information is a resource, whilst technology is a methodology. And I think we are making good progress, particularly with labour market information, using technology to source rich, reliable, up-to-date labour market information and disseminating it. There needs probably to be more support for professionals in using labour market information. I think ICT is completely different in the sense that it's a tool for delivery. And whilst we've talked a lot about the integration of those two domains, I've heard little about the implementation of ICT and new methodologies for practice. But again, the Employee ID project has 3 case studies of the implementation of the integration of labour market information with ICT in 3 pairs in Europe. And I think those 3 case studies provide us with some interesting signposts for how we might take this massive, and it is a massive kind of institutional change forward in particular pairs, to introduce these sorts of innovations while supporting the professionals within them. Methodologies around change management, around persuading managers to come up with the resources, which again we heard from Remo and Jana this morning, that resources are clearly needed, and conceptual tools are necessary to take our services forward. So I think my emphasis would be on reprofessionalising and supporting the professionalisations of our practitioners, and to emphasise how it is important to have highly professionalised staff to support individuals in labour market transitions, and then think about this implementation issue. You know, once we've got these tools, how do we make sure that they're embedded in practice for the benefit of clients and customers?
Okay, it seems like I'm the only person who's repeating this roundtable, so I'll try not to repeat myself in what I'm going to say, because there's a big risk of doing that, because I've already talked about options for the future. So not to do so. What I'm going to do is, let's say, to frame this question in terms of the role of guidance more at large, with a more macro perspective, and let's say on its role in society and the economy. So what I would attribute, let's say, 4 roles for, let's say, pathways for development and for growth of the role of guidance, which of course are fed by this going in deeper into the context and supported by ICT developments. So the first one would be to contribute to generate a career learning culture. So something which can be cross-sectoral, can exist in all sectors, all contexts, and can be introduced, let's say, in the strategic policies that address the enterprises, address the schools. So this we have been saying of going down to context. So this would be, at the end, to harness the potential of the labor market intelligence created and insert it in a pedagogical fashion into these environments. So this should be, let's say, a cornerstone of the policies aiming at the development of human resources, competences of staff, etc., in these different sectors. The second one is that guidance can act as a sort of quality check on a number of important practices, what is called matching currently in labor market services, on the way job placements are done, the way apprenticeship placements are done. So guidance can be introduced as a check, a permanent check on how these processes are driven, and this can be an object for both national and European regulation or initiative or something like that. Also, the check is also done from the perspective that guidance can enable better information about the people who are benefiting from the services, and also can regulate the quality of the information which is provided in terms of demand in the labor market. The third role would be a role regarding social justice, since guidance can operate as a social justice principle in the sense that it contributes to reduction of segmentation. It has a positioning in guaranteeing equity and access to learning opportunities, to qualifications, to a number of issues, and in assuring that all procedures associated with the labor market have a certain ethical level. So guidance in policy terms can be positioned in this way and can work, let's say, as an oil for policy in several policy fields in the economy, particularly in economic policy and in labor market policy. And it can be referenced in this way as a practical tool to oil and to insert ethics. Fourth would be guidance as a community builder. We have a lot of disaggregated communities, especially in rural areas and areas which have been heavily affected by disindustrialization. We also have crisis of private life, because people are finding it hard also to strike good work balances, to achieve dignity at work. And so this idea of building community and acquiring or relaunching the idea of citizenship, of full citizenship, should be part of guidance, or guidance should be part of this type of social project. In a way, it should be constitutive to the idea of sustainable growth and development of society. So I'll just leave these very wide messages.
Okay, thank you. I suppose in agreement with the previous speakers, I would just look at, from a very, very practical perspective, what can guidance services actually do? We talk about policy. We had an outline yesterday from Alison Crabb from the Commission as to where guidance is part of various different policies. And if we go back to the ELGPN guidelines and what guidance can actually do, and the sectors that guidance can actually work in, and we look back at those and are very, very practical, those 6 areas: adult education, VET, schools, higher education, the public employment services and the private sector, that really covers everybody in the community. But what is very interesting then, and from what I'm hearing in different workshops, we know that all member states are not the same. Not only are our guidance services not the same, our services are not the same. So we have a potential role for guidance services to become the advocates and to lead the networks, to engage with stakeholders. When you're dealing with a client or a group, and you want them to move on because of unemployment to adult education, and there is no adult education literacy service in the geographical area, who do you tell? Where does that information go to? So there's an opportunity for guidance services to advocate on behalf of their clients, on behalf of the groups that they're working with. When we talk about outreach services, I think we have an opportunity again for guidance services to take the lead, develop the network so you can deliver the outreach work. You can't expect a community group or an NGO or a national agency to invite a public employment service in to speak to their people attending their programs if they don't know where their connections might be. So the National Guidance Forum at member state level, whether it's local, regional, national, whatever version is suitable, there are huge opportunities from within the recommendations that have been there from the Council resolutions and the ELGPN guidelines. I suppose two final points where we're looking at social issues and technological shifts. A lack of ICT skills is a social issue. We take for granted. I'm sure most of you here, have you got your bank on your app on your phone? Can you transfer money and pay a bill on your phone right now if you really, really needed to? Have you got your boarding pass on your phone? Okay, so we take ICT skills as a given, as something that we can all do. We take access to Wi-Fi and broadband as a given. It's not. We talk about the millions of population who aren't accessing services, who have lower levels of skills. What's the broadband like in a regional, remote area of Germany or Spain or Portugal? And look at the realities of those hard to reach clients before we expect them to go online and look at labour market information and travel to northern Germany to get a job when they're actually based in, somewhere in the Black Forest. I mean, that's, being facetious, but we need to be realistic. And our guidance services have to be based and look at the local needs of the local people that we're actually dealing with. But also in seeing lack of ICT skills and literacy skills as a social issue and a challenge for guidance services. It's not just access to Wi-Fi. Maybe somebody can't access the service because of childcare, because of transport issues. There are lots of other reasons, and I think we need to be careful and include ICT as an automatic delivery as part of a suite of our services. But it's not the only one. We need to look at the human contact, getting out into community groups where maybe the Wi-Fi is not as good as we would hope it to be. I would echo what Jenny mentioned in relation to the guidance practitioners and their qualifications. But in looking at supporting an individual and supporting a group through a personal crisis, looking through transition from unemployment to employment, from employment to something else, getting training, taking career change, whatever it is that the person is dealing with, guidance counsellors and guidance practitioners can't be all things to all people. We have to look at the development of specific skills and speciality skills in the guidance profession as well. But in looking at the original training of the guidance counsellors, having adaptability skills ourselves, it is no point in us just learning about counselling skills or human development. We need to look at all of this in the context of, and how does this help somebody develop their career management skills? How do we teach them? How do we facilitate them to develop their own career management skills? So that we can help the client and the group of clients to adapt, to develop flexibility, to develop their own transitional coping mechanisms and skills. So a lot of it has to go back to our own training and our CPD, and not expecting the guidance counsellors to know everything, but to know where to go to get the information. And then my final point would be in relation to LMI and learning opportunities being available online. Absolutely, if we don't have them at the touch of a button, we aren't going to be able to trawl through all the relevant information. But is that the role of the guidance service, or is that the role of national organisations, state fund organisations, to make sure that this information is available to be used as tools? We have to be careful that we're not expecting guidance services to do everything and be the miracle cure that we were talking about yesterday.
Maybe also you could already answering also this question, reacting to the others and looking at, as you are a representative of the state, what should be the role of how do you see the national role of the national institutions in this process of going further?
In a more general way, first of all, I think that we are now talking about the future of work, and quite often it's described like uncertainty. Nobody knows what's going to happen, and robots will take over, and technology will change everything, and the jobs that exist here right now will not exist in the future, and it doesn't give so much confidence to younger or older people. I think that the role of guidance services is just opposite. It's to give confidence, self-confidence, and then information to all of people. Of course, there are many people which don't use ICT, and that's part of, or there is the question, what the national governments can do to give the skills, to educate them. It's not, of course, a question of lifelong guidance. It's when the need is somehow seen by the guidance, it's possible to talk about it, to solve these questions. But we have actually a lot of data. We can predict what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years, and that's why we need people who can translate the needs of a labor market, needs of future, to people which really maybe don't have access to ICT. But of course, it's needed to translate also to the people which have access, but maybe they could develop themselves and have better skills. So there are very, very many layers, of course. But what could the governments do? Now, even here in small Estonia, we are still having many different ministries in a way doing the same thing. And I think that's the case in most of our countries, but that's not 100% clear who is responsible for that. And it's not clear on European level either. So there are questions, who is responsible and what is exactly to be done to really give this self-confidence and knowledge about what and how should be done.
Would you like to go further from here on maybe stressing a little bit on the roles of the national level and on the European institutions, because you have all probably contacts with both of them.
Thank you. Well, I think the sort of integration and the joining up the dots that we talked about, that, you know, we up to now we've been developing guidance within specific sectors, and really if we're to support the individual and the individual-centered approach, we need to have a sort of smooth transition for the individual between these systems as well as life progresses. And I think that has to be done first and foremost at national level, perhaps through the policy fora that were talked about, but also through cooperation between the different organizations and different actors. At European level, I think we can support this, of course, through the tools that we have, but also through future policy, because as Alison said yesterday, guidance is built in to policy in all of the sectors and also across the sectors. There's a policy element to all the transparency tools, to the validation recommendation, now to the upskilling pathways, to the VET. And of course, going forward in the post-2020 policy, we have to see how that can be developed. And in fact, in the Erasmus Plus program, the idea was that you could have lifelong learning projects, that you could have projects that are not just sector-based, that include a number of sectors. But this, in practice, seems to be quite difficult to achieve, because I don't see too many of those projects in the program, but it is something to be looked at, and as going forward with whatever programs come out of the next financial period, this is also something to develop. And more generally on the financing, I think it was mentioned a lot yesterday that, you know, developing these systems requires financing. So of course, most of that will have to come from national resources, but there is a lot of European Social Fund money invested at national level in developing lifelong learning, in developing initiatives for disadvantaged groups. And I think some of this, the way some of this money is spent could be looked at, and also to try and earmark some of this money for guidance at national level, because this is where the bigger amounts of funding are available, rather than in the transnational programs. And of course, in our bread and butter, I suppose, work with the member states, which is the organizing peer learning and mutual learning, guidance certainly is an issue that will have to be looked at in the future. But of course, there again, the themes for mutual learning and for cooperation, they come from the requests from member states. So in fact, also you have to be pushing with your ministries for education, with your ministries for labour, and so on. And I guess now that our unit has moved to DG Employment, I guess we understand also better the problems of bringing the education and the labour market worlds together, and we also have to work on it at a European level. Thank you.
Please, from both of you as well, and then be prepared. I think we will have time for 1 or 2 questions to the panelists, and we will do it in a very analog manner this time. So when we get these answers after that, you will have a chance to raise your hand.
Okay. So national and European level, I mean, as somebody who is from England, I'm probably not best positioned to talk about this. However, it is obvious over my, sort of 20, 30, 40 years association with career guidance that it's the national level where policies are decided and whether notice is taken or not. of European recommendations. I think Europe is extremely helpful in the sense that it develops strategies and policies that supports guidance, but in my bitter experience, that it is at national level, whether or not that's acted on or not acted on. I think one of the other sort of points about national and European level from a researcher's point of view is that we talked this morning, and we've talked throughout the conference, about the need for an evidence base for practice, so we can argue our case with policymakers and ministers. And actually, the evidence base is pretty substantial now, and we keep on getting reviews, academic reviews on the evidence of impact. There's just been another one published from the US, which is again saying that even looking across the board at all the kind of psychometric interventions that are enacted in a career counselling intervention, the outstanding element in that helping process is the counsellor, the practitioner, and the relationship he or she makes with the client customer. And it remains a bit of a puzzle when we keep on having these recurrent sets of evidence based on robust research that this tends to be systematically ignored at the same time as national policymakers are calling for robust evidence to prove the worth of our services. So I guess we just need to try to work as constructively as we can with at a national level to try to get notice taken of the evidence base that we have around the efficacy of our services and the positive impact it has on our clients and customers in all sorts of disadvantaged groups, all sorts of privileged groups at all sorts of levels. You know, we have evidence that they benefit from services, and where national agencies can work with European agencies, then it will be even more powerful. So I voted to stay. I want it on record.
Okay. So a lot of the points which I feel I may touch were already mentioned, especially at national level. I think a lot has been said. A lot of ideas came out also during these days, so I would sort of just elaborate on some of the things which were said, because essentially I think that this the structured exchange to stimulate innovation needs to be taken forward. It should be linked to the existence of a centralized database, if this is the way we are going to go, and also linked to an actual technical support to the adoption of innovations. So to this extent, so I would just say that countries, let's say relevant agents in countries, need to be supported in devising business cases and planning that make sense for their organizations, so that they can take forward these innovations on a very practical level. So I think that at EU level, both financial and technical assistance can exist somehow for this to be made more possible and more effective. Also, I think that one interesting idea that came about is that the EU level can support international diffusion. This is interesting. So not all is left to the countries, but actually the European level can suggest some tools, some methodologies to, let's say, reach stakeholders in the countries and activate the dialogue between relevant stakeholders. So I think this is something good to carry home, at least for me. Also, there's a lot about distinct contexts, and we've been talking about reaching into distinct contexts. So it might make sense to have an integrated reasoning on how the activity is, let's say, framed across these contexts. What is common in terms of competences of both service and practitioners, common and different across these contexts. So possibly this is also an object for European level reflection and work. Finally, something that Martina also referred, which is this interaction between policy fields. I think this is definitely something that can happen a bit more at European level. I agree it's not an easy job, let's say it's not an easy thing to do, but we need to see how this interplay of economic policy, education and employment policy can be effective, and how guidance can be effectively integrated also as a pivotal force in this interplay between distinct policy fields, and consequently administrations or parts of administrations. So definitely this can be a reflection for a European level in collaboration with national authorities.
Thank you. Looking at the national picture first, I think there's a couple of issues. I think where we know ourselves that in each member state country the guidance services are quite separated. We have the education-based guidance services and we have the public employment service-based guidance services. And in some cases it's at conferences like these that the practitioners or the managers of those actually meet each other, because they don't meet at home. So I think we need to start with that in creating the opportunities, the networking opportunities at home to provide support for the public employment and the education-based services to actually talk to each other, but also to recommend to our parent departments or ministries that they should talk to each other. Because I think if we want at the European Commission level the two various different policy groups to talk to each other, that needs to be happening at national level. And I think guidance services, back to my point about being the kind of the glue that brings everybody together, I think the opportunity to set up national guidance fora, if we haven't already, to actually try bring that together at national level is one thing. I think also for national ministries, departments, agencies to act as the broker on behalf of the guidance service. So for example, if adult education and guidance services are very, very distinct, if the national agencies for those two, managing those two, were to talk to each other, again, there's a role for guidance to lead that, and for the role of broker and networking and advocating. I think from a funding perspective, and looking at the training of guidance practitioners across the board at national level, what is expected? What are we talking about when we say a guidance practitioner in country X looks like? What's the qualification? What's the requirement? So at least we're looking at some level of standard of delivery then. And looking at the funding for the guidance services themselves, including the development of ICT delivery. So funding and strategic planning within, for the use of that funding is a key point. Looking then at a European context, I think we've had these conversations over and over. Those of us who've been involved in ELGPN would have been involved in a proposal that went to the European Commission. And I think it was really, really good that Alison outlined the various different areas, and you've mentioned as well the various different areas that guidance policies are there. But realistically, unless and until we have a section of the Commission that has the title guidance somewhere on the door and somewhere in their letterhead with responsibility for lifelong guidance and linking with all of the other agencies, we will be having this conversation again in another 5 years. So I think I think one thing I would like to see to come out of this conference, with all the positive messages and the genuine interest in the developments of lifelong guidance, we really need the Commission to take that consideration on board. And proposals have been made in that regard, so I'm not even going to suggest what they should look like at this point. But I think also to add to Pedro's point, where the Commission is requiring or suggesting or requesting a member state might, report on something, member states do take that on board. They may ignore some of them, but they do look at it and say, oh, right, well, we do have to report on this, especially if funding is allocated. And it does have an impact. It has an impact at national, local and regional level. And I suppose my final point would be to echo what Mika has mentioned, and I know we've had various conversations over coffee. We had a resolution in 2004. We had a guidance resolution in 2008. It's 2017. We have ICT and guidance. We have frameworks for guidance practitioner training. We have various different countries have great examples of career management skills programs. A lot of work has been done, and the member states have taken huge strides forward as a result of the work that everybody bought into with the ELGPN and the Euroguidance network and the work that's going on there. So I would echo Mika's suggestion yesterday that we would ask the Commission to consider a new resolution on guidance.
Thank you very much. So now is this totally last great chance to ask one question. Do we have that one person? Because otherwise we won't have time to do all the other nice things we will do more. So take this possibility. It's a lifetime chance. And you will have a very nice microphone when you ask your question. No one? You're like Estonians, all of you. Very silent. No? Okay. But maybe Mr. Laidmets would like to say the last words then for this panel.
No, if there are no questions, I will be silent.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yes, thank you.